The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 21st chapter. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? The Pharisees and chief priests said to Jesus, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone'? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. The Gospel of the Lord. Just a few verses prior to today's reading, the Pharisees and the chief priests, the religious authorities, confront Jesus. They ask him from whom he has received his authority. And today's text is a response to their question. As we know and will see, it is from God whom Jesus has received his authority. Authority to establish God's kingdom on earth. Unlike the parable, God's kingdom is a grand vineyard with no fences and no watchtowers, where all are invited to dwell and will be nourished by the fruits of the kingdom. Those of us who have never relied on land for our nourishment might view this parable as a metaphor for God's reign and justice, but it is not. This parable is a statement about life in the Roman Empire and the systems which create and perpetuate class division and food insecurity. The rich increased their wealth through the acquisition and exploitation of land which had been tended, tilled, and cared for by the same families for many generations. Without titles of land ownership, families were forced to surrender their land to the wealthy, from whom they would later seek employment as tenant farmers. Distracted by the stabbing pain of hunger and fully aware that scores of other landless families were eager for work, tenant workers took whatever wage they were offered. They were contractually obligated to operate the vineyard and assume all of its expenses from their small portion of the harvest. As a result, tenant farmers were plunged into deep, escalating debt, and the debt, if not paid, was passed on to their children, who would likely become the landowner's slaves. There was no escaping the stress of this system. The tenant farmers were bound to a land which no longer nourished their families, and they were supervised by slaves who reflected their own futures, while the landowners profited off their misery. This parable is a statement about the harsh and unforgiving reality of life in the Roman Empire. it is not a reflection of God's justice. It was the Pharisees who said the landowner would be justified to put those wretched tenants to a miserable death for having committed murder and refusing to give up the harvest. It was the Pharisees' expectation, their hope, that justice would be manifest in this way. And if we're honest, it is often our hope and our expectation too. But it is not Jesus' hope, nor his intention. Through this parable, Jesus exposes and indicts the wretched and miserable systems that culminate in greed and violence. God is not the landowner who exploits the tenants, and God does not create systems which rob people of their dignity and integrity, deprive them their human rights, degrade relationships, drive people to commit reprehensible crimes, and then punish them when they break under the weight of the system. This is not God's action. This is human action. We do this. God is absent from this parable. God is the stone the builders rejected. These human-made godless systems, the antithesis of the kingdom, exist today. Each year, millions of acres of land are taken from indigenous people and given to rich multinational corporations. People are removed from ancient family lands and forced to work at sub-poverty wages for companies now occupying their land. Unable to support their families, parents remove their children from school, and those not sold into slavery or prostitution are integrated into the exploitative workforce. These systems exist in our local communities too. Low-income housing developments are torn down and replaced with properties generating a greater tax revenue. The unemployed and underemployed search for work while the success of the free market economy requires a certain level of unemployment. And the marginally employed toil at jobs for less than a living wage and without adequate benefits. Like the landowner, we benefit from these systems, from these wretched and miserable systems. We rely on palm oil harvested from plantations in the former Indonesian rainforest. We depend on tax revenue for the advancement of our public school systems, and we appreciate low-cost products and high-yielding profits produced by low-wage employees. We are stuck, implicated, whether we like it or not, in these godless, wretched, and miserable systems. Though the systems we create are godless, and therefore seem hopeless, our situation is not. God, who creates everything out of nothing, transforms the wretched and the miserable into beauty and joy. By God's action in Jesus Christ, the cross, a repulsive instrument of torture, is transformed into God's tool of liberation and redemption. By God's action through Jesus Christ, the tomb, a repository of death, darkness, and futility, is transformed into a geyser bursting with life, light, and hope. By God's power and authority, Jesus reveals God's kingdom on earth. Stone by stone, Jesus exposes, indicts, and transforms godless systems, systems which crush people and break communities. Stones ripped from the earth's belly, leaving gaping wounds, are transformed into sacred jewels, decorating the earth like morning dew. Through Jesus, the blind see, the paralyzed walk, the hungry are full, and the thirsty are quenched. The dead are raised to life, the grieving are comforted, the egotistical are humbled, the power-hungry become agents of empowerment, and the godless become bearers of God's kingdom. Unlike the son in the parable, Jesus does not demand respect or payment. Rather, as God's holy authorized agent, Jesus freely offers us God's kingdom and invites us to step out of our human-made fences and join him in revealing God's kingdom to the world. With God working through us, we see the world not just as it is, but as God intends for it to be. And we join Jesus in his mission of transforming the world. Together we turn dull stones into glistening gems. We dismantle systems which perpetuate human suffering and recreate systems based in justice, equality, and love. Fences are torn down, watchtowers abandoned, relationships are mended, land is restored, and people are fed. In the godless places of your life, God is at work creating beauty and joy. For God's justice rises out of the wretched and miserable. Jesus, the incarnate God, stands squarely in the middle of your godless abysses and transforms them through his mercy and grace. Jesus does not condemn a wretched people to a miserable death. Quite the contrary. Jesus died a wretched and miserable death so that you and I and all people might live. By the authority of God in your baptism, you have been claimed and remade from a stone into a sacred jewel. Wherever you are, wherever you stand, you are a witness to and an agent of God's transformative action in the world. There is no fence and there is no watchtower. You are free to roam wherever you like in God's kingdom, and God will always be with you. This is the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes.